He walked into a restaurant like any other customer, calm, polite, dressed sharp. But from the moment he sat down, something felt off. The waiter smirked, the dismissive tone, the slow service. Every move screamed one thing: you don't belong here. He didn't argue. He didn't shout. He just watched quietly as disrespect unfolded in front of strangers, pretending not to see. But what no one in that room knew was that the man they were laughing at didn't just belong there. He owned the place. This isn't just a story about arrogance. It's about what happens when ignorance meets quiet power. It was a Saturday afternoon like any other in the heart of the city. The lunch crowd was spilling into cafes and restaurants, the sound of chatter blending with the clinking of silverware. Among them walked David Carter, a man in his early 40s, calm, confident, and understated. To anyone watching, he looked like another businessman taking a quiet break from a long week. But there was more to him than met the eye. David wasn't just another customer looking for a meal. He was the silent backbone behind a chain of restaurants that had risen from nothing but determination and faith. A self-made entrepreneur, he believed in creating places where everyone, no matter their color, background, or past, could feel welcome. Ironically, it was in one of those very places that his faith in equality would be tested. As he walked into the restaurant that day, he didn't announce who he was. He didn't flash his name or status. He simply wanted to experience his business through the eyes of a customer, something he often did to understand the people he served. The hostess gave a polite but hesitant smile, leading him to a corner table near the window. He noticed her discomfort, but brushed it off. Maybe she was just having a long day. But when the waiter arrived, his tone was sharp, his eyes dismissive, his smile forced. David's stomach tightened. He knew that look. He had seen it before. What began as a quiet lunch would soon become a public lesson, one that would expose the dangerous assumptions people make based on the color of a man's skin. The waiter's name was Mark, young, confident, with that smug kind of charm that only some people mistake for professionalism. He looked at David the way someone looks at an inconvenience. When he handed over the menu, his hand hesitated, not out of respect, but reluctance. David thanked him softly, pretending not to notice the slight delay, the absence of eye contact, or the way Mark greeted other customers: smiles, laughter, conversation. With David, it was silence. Minutes passed. Orders were taken from tables that had just arrived. Drinks were refilled, plates cleared, checks delivered. But at David's table, the glass of water remained empty, condensation dripping slowly down the side, a perfect reflection of the coldness he was receiving. He watched quietly, not because he was afraid to speak up, but because he wanted to see, to observe the full extent of what was happening when he wasn't the owner, when he was just a black man in a nice suit trying to enjoy lunch. Eventually, he raised his hand politely, asking if he could finally place his order. Mark didn't even turn his head at first. When he did, he sighed, loudly enough for the nearby table to notice. "Yeah, give me a second," he muttered before walking away again. That second turned into 10 long minutes. 10 minutes of glances, whispers, and uncomfortable silence. A couple at the next table whispered softly. The woman shifted uncomfortably, knowing what was happening but choosing silence. Across the room, a manager passed by, a woman in her 50s with a clipboard and practiced smile. She noticed David's table and hesitated, but instead of stepping in, she walked away, pretending not to see. It wasn't new to David, the subtle avoidance, the unspoken approval of discrimination. This was how racism often looked in polished places. Not with shouting, not with violence, but with smiles and silence. When Mark finally returned, his tone was clipped. "We're out of what you asked for," he said quickly. "Maybe try something else." David glanced at the menu. The dish was one of the restaurant's staples. He knew it better than anyone. It wasn't sold out, but he stayed calm. He ordered something else. Moments later, a different waiter, a young Latina woman, brought food to another table nearby. The same dish. David's heart sank, but his expression never changed. He smiled politely, thanked her, and returned to his meal that still hadn't arrived. This wasn't just about bad service anymore. It was about humiliation, the kind that seeps in quietly and cuts deep. Every delayed order, every fake smile, every dismissive gesture was a reminder that, to some, success, class, or dignity meant nothing if your skin didn't fit their expectations. The restaurant began to fill up. The air grew louder, the laughter sharper, but David's table stayed cold. He leaned back, his eyes drifting toward the front counter, where Mark now stood laughing with another waiter. It wasn't just arrogance anymore. It was comfort and cruelty. And that's when David made a decision. He wasn't going to walk out quietly. He was going to show them exactly who they were disrespecting, not through anger, but through truth. Because sometimes the most powerful statement isn't made with raised voices, but with quiet revelation. David sat quietly, watching the waiter's laughter echo across the dining floor. The restaurant hummed with comfort and familiarity, except at his table, where time seemed to stand still. He glanced at his watch. It was almost time for his meeting, and that meeting wasn't across town. It was here. A few minutes later, the glass door swung open. A small group entered, 3 people in business attire. They walked straight toward David's table with purpose. The chatter in the room softened as they approached. "Mr. Williams," said a woman in a tailored gray suit, "we're ready whenever you are." Mark's laughter stopped. His face froze. The clipboard manager turned, her polite smile faltering as she recognized the woman, the district regional director. David stood, buttoning his jacket slowly. His calmness carried weight, the kind that made silence louder than shouting ever could. He gave a small, courteous nod to his guests and spoke clearly, letting his words carry across the room. "Before we start," he said, "I'd like to thank everyone here for your hospitality." The sarcasm in his tone was gentle but undeniable. Heads turned. Conversation stopped. Even the clinking of glasses seemed to fade away. Mark swallowed hard. Sir, David looked directly at him. "You didn't know, did you?" His voice was low, almost sympathetic. "You didn't know who I was." Mark's face turned pale. The manager took a cautious step forward, whispering, "Mr. Williams, I had no idea." David raised a hand, stopping her mid-sentence. "You shouldn't have to know who someone is to treat them with respect." The words cut through the air like a verdict. Across the room, employees exchanged glances, realizing the truth. David Williams, the man who had been ignored, disrespected, and humiliated, wasn't just a customer. He was the major shareholder, the man whose signature was on their paychecks. He turned to the regional director. "Let's proceed with the meeting," he said calmly. "Right here. I want everyone to see what leadership looks like." The group sat down. The same waiter who had mocked him moments earlier now stood frozen, tray trembling in his hand. David didn't need to raise his voice. His presence, his dignity, did all the talking. And as the meeting began, everyone in that restaurant learned something money couldn't buy, that respect should never depend on recognition. When the meeting ended, the atmosphere in the restaurant had completely changed. The laughter that once filled the air was gone, replaced by quiet tension and shame. The same waiter who once sneered now stood with his head low, unable to meet David's eyes. But David didn't lash out. He didn't raise his voice or demand retribution. Instead, he walked over to the young hostess who had watched everything unfold earlier, the one who had looked uncomfortable as it all happened. "You did nothing wrong," he said softly. "Next time, just remember, silence in the face of wrong is also a choice." Her eyes glistened. She nodded. David turned back to the table where Mark stood frozen, apology trembling on his lips. "You judged me before you served me," David said quietly. "You saw color, not character. Position, not person." Mark swallowed hard. I'm sorry, sir. David looked at him for a long moment, then replied, Don't be sorry to me. Be better to the next man who looks like me. And with that he left. No anger, no revenge, just grace, the kind that teaches louder than punishment ever could. Weeks later, word spread that the restaurant's management underwent diversity and ethics training, mandated by the very man they had mistreated. Employees began to treat every guest differently, not out of fear, but out of awareness. And David, he never spoke publicly about the incident. He didn't have to. The story traveled on its own, whispered by witnesses, shared online, retold by strangers. Because in the end, this wasn't just about one man being disrespected. It was about what happens when the world forgets the simplest truth, that respect should never be earned through power, but given through humanity. And maybe that's the lesson we all need to remember. So, if stories like this move you, if they remind you of the change that still needs to happen, then share it, talk about it, and subscribe. Because silence never changed the world, but stories just might.